Sorry, guys. We have some breaking news. Jay, if you could stand by. Kelly, if you could stand by as well. We do want to talk about those extreme temperatures, but we're getting some breaking news in from the White House now. We are learning the president has, in fact, tested positive for COVID-19. He has been twice boosted, so that means he's had 4 shots at this point. And I'm just going to read for you a statement that we're getting from White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, saying, in fact, he is fully vaccinated, twice boosted. He's experiencing, as they are putting it, very mild symptoms. He's also taking Paxilvid at this moment, consistent with the CDC guidelines. They go on. He will isolate at the White House and will continue to carry out all of his duties fully during that time. And he has been in contact with members of the White House staff by phone this morning and will participate and continue to participate in his planning meetings for the day from the White House, despite the fact that he has now, in fact, tested positive. I want to bring in Peter Alexander, who's standing by for us at the White House. Quite some breaking news on this, Peter, as we're learning of the president now testing positive for COVID here. Thankfully, though, vaccinated and boosted multiple times, experiencing mild symptoms. What else are you learning?
Well, you detailed what we're just hearing from the press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre. Obviously, we're just receiving that statement from her moments ago. I want to make sure you hear me. This is obviously breaking news. In my microphone, I will throw it on for you. Make it easier
So
to
is
talk.
live television. There you go.
There you go. Live television. Obviously, we just hustled outside. We've been trying to speak to aides here for any better details. There you hear really clearly now. So the president did, as you know, test positive. We just got that information from Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary. Within the last 5 minutes or so, President Biden was scheduled today to be traveling to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania for an event. Clearly, he's not going to be able to make that trip as a function of this new test. We are reaching out as we speak to the First Lady's office as well, trying to get any better detail on whether, in fact, she may have tested positive as well. Obviously, President Biden at 79 years old, there has been a lot of concern about his health and safety over the course of his presidency, the oldest president ever to take office. And significantly, this is a president who folks have paid close attention to his health over the course of his time in office. He repeatedly coughs often when he begins. The doctor in his last physical communicated that that was a form of reflux that he had been dealing with, but it often had us asking questions about whether he had tested positive or not. The testing cadence, we were told, had been routine, although the White House had never said specifically how often President Biden had tested. Here you see pictures from just yesterday when he was in Massachusetts delivering remarks. At the time, it was unclear whether or not there was anything wrong with his health. He appeared to be just fine, as best one could tell. I traveled aboard Air Force One with him just last week as we were in Israel, the West Bank, and in Saudi Arabia. And the president, like all of those traveling with him, were required to undergo testing on a routine basis to make sure that they were well. But again, obviously, this is significant breaking news. This is a 79-year-old president who right now is dealing with what are described as mild symptoms, but obviously there is great concern about his health and safety at this time. You know, honestly, Yasmin, at this moment, we're trying to get a better sense of understanding about how this will impact the next several days for this president. But clearly, he's going to be in isolation, even if he can work from a distance from aides over the course of the next 5+ days, we imagine.
Well, and I'm wondering, Peter, and you may not have this information, but how long do we know the president is actually going to be in isolation? Because in certain instances, right, there are folks that test positive for COVID, and after 5 days of isolation, they're allowed to go back to their lives and not necessarily even having to retest and or test negative in order to resume life. Do we know at all how long the president is going to be isolating for?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't. We have asked that very question right now. I do think they're going to follow all the CDC protocols on this, obviously, so the president can lead by example. You know, even to this point, we've seen him wearing a mask often when he meets inside with individuals. He was wearing masks at times during the course of his travel over the last week. So I think they're going to do everything they can to be as careful about his health here, obviously. But to be totally sincere, this is breaking news to us, and we're going to try to get a better understanding. We're certainly pushing the White House for more details about how this will impact their plans. But again, to be clear, this announcement that President Biden has tested positive for COVID was made just this morning. The test happening just this morning as well. Now, about 2.5 years into this pandemic, for the first time, President Biden is tested positive.
I want to bring Yamiche Alcindor, who's on set with me now, rushing in. Thank you, Yamiche, as we're getting this breaking news. Peter, if you could stand by as well, because we do want to kind of keep you there for us as things are developing with this breaking news story. It's not necessarily surprising, right? COVID has been swirling around this president for quite some time. At one point, the vice president testing positive as well. He's had several contacts over the last few months who have, in fact, have tested positive. The president continuing to test negative. However, today now getting that positive test, as Peter said, 79 years of age. However, now taking Paxilvid. You think about also this schedule ahead, what he's doing right now, what he's trying to accomplish, and how this might actually kind of halt things for a moment as he deals with this COVID positive test.
I mean, there's so many things that this White House has been having to deal with and juggle. And now you have the leader of the United States, President Biden, testing positive for COVID. It is absolutely a wrench in the plans here. I will say that I've been talking to White House officials for months about this. They have been planning at the White House for the moment, the day when this happened. They do believe that he will have, they believe, at least when I talk to them, mild symptoms because they believe he's had his booster shot. He's been vaccinated. He's someone who really has tried to take this pandemic very, very seriously. He was elected on the idea that he was going to be the one who brought in the experienced team, who was going to be the president who could figure out this pandemic. And he has been the person who has made sure that vaccinations have gone out throughout the country, that Americans have continued to talk about the pandemic. But I think, Yasmin, it's also a reminder, right, that we are living in a pandemic. There are so many things that often become the things that are the top priorities, whether it's inflation or whether it's foreign policy in Ukraine or whether it's the January 6 hearings that are going to be historic tonight. All of those things are happening, but at the backdrop of that is this pandemic that is continuing to make Americans sick, that is continuing to kill Americans, and that has killed more than 1 million Americans. And there are so many Americans across the country that are mourning the loss of loved ones and are also having to deal with their own COVID diagnoses that I think it's a reminder for all of us, including the president, that this is still the thing that they wake up at every morning to think about at the White House. When I talk to them about all the other issues they're juggling, COVID never is not on that list, right? Yeah. This is a White House that understands still that it's looming, that is the thing that's on top of people's minds. And by the way, it's the thing that when voters wake up in the morning and they leave their homes, it's the thing that we're reminded about every day, right? You have to put on your mask or do something. Something has happened in your life that has changed because of COVID every single day. And this is, I think, a reminder of just how serious these times are.
Well, and if you didn't think COVID was still a threat right now with this Omicron variant of BA5 that they say at some points are surpassing kind of the vaccinations and more people are getting sick multiple times, often in 1 month. I have a friend who tested positive just a couple of weeks ago, tested positive once again. It is still very much a threat. And by the way, it does not discriminate. The president of the United States now, in fact, testing positive, despite the fact that he has done everything right, both testing and getting vaccinated as well. And if you're an American that did not think this was something to take seriously, you see the president once again having to now deal with a COVID diagnosis.
This virus does not discriminate. As you said, the president has it now. I also think it's a reminder that there are still people who have been the most impacted, and that is people of color and poor people who have not had at times the same resources to do the things like stay at home, like work remotely. You know, we throw around those terms that became, I think, the terms of this pandemic, the terms of this generation, social distancing. But I've talked to so many people who can't social distance, have to work. They're driving our buses. They're in our grocery stores. They're doing all of the sort of essential work that Americans maybe didn't think of as essential work, because we think of essential workers and we think of firefighters and doctors and all of those people who, of course, are incredibly important during these times. But we also think about the least among us, the people who keep this economy running. They have been impacted disproportionately by COVID. And then, of course, add to that the fact that now the president of the United States is having to deal with this. But the president's also talked about that a lot, right? And when you think about sort of the way that he's handled COVID, he's always talked about the fact that this is a virus that it doesn't matter your political party, even though it's become polarized. You can get this virus, you can get really sick. And I have to say, even with the vaccines and the boosters, we have to remind that there are people that are living with long COVID here. And that is very scary.
And we still don't necessarily know the effects of long COVID. And by the way, we're trying to get a doctor to talk to us as well, because the effects of long COVID and possibly multiple diagnoses of COVID, what are the effects of that, especially for someone, and by the way, I know he hasn't had multiple diagnoses, but he's now tested positive for COVID. He's 79 years old. So what does that mean for his life going forward if, in fact, he develops any kind of long COVID symptoms? And then you got to think about, this is a president who's been traveling a lot. right, in the lead up to the midterm elections. We're looking at his approval rating. I believe the latest approval numbers are out. They're pretty low. He's at 31% in one of the polls that I saw just this morning, right? And who he came in contact with during these travels. Just the other day, we're looking at the governor of Rhode Island, the mayor of Warwick, Rhode Island, upon his visit there, Senator Markey, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Representative Bill Keating. I mean, these are a lot of folks that he's been coming into contact with over the last couple of days, and that's why it's not necessarily surprising, his diagnosis, but then you got a lot of folks that are likely worried about what this means for them going forward because, of course, of the implications of long COVID. Yeah, and think about the fact that now we have 2 U.S. presidents in a row that have tested positive with COVID. And I think what we're going to see here is likely a different sort of approach to it. Let's remember his predecessor took off his mask, even though it was sort of in the period where he could have possibly infected other people. He didn't want to talk about getting vaccinated at the White House. President Biden, I suspect, just in talking to White House officials, is going to remind people, yes, I could get it, which means you can get it, which means we all have to be vigilant about this. And also, of course, this diagnosis really does mean that he's going to have to really quarantine himself and stay away from people while he was under pressure to be out on the campaign trail, to be out in the world, to show that he was doing something, because he has Democrats in particular who are saying there are all these sort of fires out there, abortion politics, all of these different things that are happening. And voters in particular during a midterm season, they need to see you out in the world. They need to make sure that they feel like you're connected and feeling their pain. And now he's not going to be able to do that. But of course, I think most people are going to say this is a time period where he needs to rest, where he needs to sort of take this very seriously, because COVID, as someone who's had it, can be very wild, can be very free-willing, can be very changing, right? You feel good on one day, and then the next day you can't get out of bed, and it really has to be something that you're very, very cognizant of when you're dealing with it. Yeah, Yamish, if you would stand by, thank you for jumping on, by the way, but just hang with me for a moment, because we do have Mike Memoli standing by for us with more information, we hope. Memoli, what are you learning, of course, from the Biden camp now, from the president's camp, learning that he has now tested positive for COVID?
Well, the early indications I'm getting is that the president's health is fine. Obviously, he has this diagnosis, and they're going to be giving him, of course, the best care imaginable, as you would expect for the president of the United States. But the early indications from sources at the White House I'm talking to is that the president feels fine. I was actually on the South Lawn of the White House last night when the president returned from that trip to Massachusetts. He was with staff. He seemed in good spirits. He actually sort of chided the reporters on the South Lawn, including myself, who were shouting questions at him because he had just answered questions to another group of reporters earlier. But it's really worth underscoring how significant this moment is. Obviously, the President of the United States being diagnosed with COVID is important, but it's important to put it in context as well, because this was a campaign that I covered in 2020 in which COVID was the #1 issue. And the Biden campaign really prided itself on the degree to which they were, and it's carried through to the White House as well, modeling the best behavior, both in terms of precautions, and the campaign took a lot of grief for that so-called basement campaign, but slowly re-ingratiating himself into campaigning in public. But even when they did that, limiting his interactions as much as possible. And then, of course, in the White House, for so much of the early months of the administration, even after the president, as president-elect, had been given his first doses of the COVID vaccine, extreme precautions were taken above and beyond even what the CDC had recommended in order to keep the president safe. Just in the last few weeks, there has been a significant back and forth between the press corps and the White House about releasing the testing results as they were coming in. We knew that the president has what they would call a regular testing cadence, often Mondays and Thursdays. The White House had sort of stopped proactively releasing the fact that he had received negative tests. But Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, just yesterday, in fact, had released information on his previous test just after he returned from Saudi Arabia, indicating that he was negative. But obviously, the timeline suggests, as the president had just returned on, I believe it was late Saturday night to Washington, that perhaps he contracted this either at the late stages of his trip or in the early stages of this week.
So Mike, we're getting some information in from our own Peter Alexander as well, because it was something that I was thinking about, the First Lady and her status. But she, in fact, has now tested negative for COVID. So that has been confirmed for the day. I want to play a little bit of what the First Lady had to say, and then we'll talk on the other end.
My husband tested positive for COVID. I talked to him just a few minutes ago. He's doing fine. He's feeling good. I tested negative this morning. I am going to keep my schedule. I am, according to CDC guidelines, I am keeping masks. And so I'd like to go in and see the program here. Learning loss as an educator means a lot to me. So thank you for being here today. Thank you.
So the president's doing fine. We know that at that point, right? Thankfully, the vice president, or excuse me, the first lady has in fact tested negative. Speaking of her husband's condition at the very moment. But that being said, I mean, as we have been talking about, this is a 79-year-old president, and that has to be something that they take extra precautions with in now learning of his positive test. I'm wondering, Mike, if there are any plans in place as to whether or not they want to move the president to possibly a hospital for monitoring. Is that something that is in the future for him, or something that they have in place if, in fact, his condition suddenly worsens?
That's not something that we've heard from White House officials at this very early stage, of course. But I have spoken very often with officials close to the president on this very issue. And they have been rather frank, both publicly and privately, in these discussions to say, listen, at some point the president will likely get COVID.
Yeah.
They were not shying from that fact. And they were emphasizing the degree to which he has, in Dr. Kevin O'Connor, his primary doctor, somebody who he has a long relationship with, somebody who has been his chief physician both when he was vice president, when he was out of office, and now, of course, he's heading the White House medical office as well. They have a very close relationship, and so he would be able to respond quickly and sense, given that long relationship, if the president's symptoms were getting worse. They also emphasized the degree to which we have treatments. This is something they tried to emphasize given where we are at as a nation in the state of COVID, that we have treatments, that we have precautions that are showing great efficacy for individuals who test positive with COVID. Yes, of course, his age is a concern, but we only need to look at other high-profile examples up to and including Queen Elizabeth II, who in her late 90s recently contracted COVID and obviously has survived and is thriving as well. And so this is something that the White House, if anything, has downplayed the inevitability that when he got COVID, that it would be a major concern. They will closely be monitoring his symptoms naturally. It's interesting you played that sound from the First Lady, because I've been thinking about the president's schedule this week. He returned, as I indicated, over the weekend from that trip to the Middle East, and then he had no public events on the schedule Monday and Tuesday of this week. He was not scheduled to participate, but he joined the First Lady when they welcomed Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine. That was a greeting, the president's greeting of her outside. You know, there were no masks because they were outside. We know that tends to be a place where transmissibility is reduced in that case. There was a photo taken of both the president, the First Lady, the Vice President, the Second Gentleman, and Ukraine's First Lady inside the diplomatic reception room shortly after. But there's no indication at this point otherwise if that exposure would be a concern for others involved. Now, I will say, if you often see photos of the president in the Oval Office and other working meetings in the White House, that it's very often, if not by the norm, that his aides in the room are always wearing the KN95 mask, the most strongest protection when they are around the president. But the president himself often is not. He has it on and off, given sometimes the circumstance. We also know, as he was traveling to Massachusetts yesterday aboard Air Force One, he was in the cabin with some of the members of Congress who were traveling with him. There were photos posted by some of them of them with the president, on Air Force One yesterday. So as the White House now enters into contact tracing mode, there are going to be some lawmakers getting probably some outreach, as well as all the other staff who were traveling with him as well.
Yeah, and I can't help but wonder, Mike, as we're looking at these live pictures, excuse me, of the First Lady in Detroit, Michigan, at her event there in the school. When was the last time the First Lady was with the president, and wondering if they have plans in place to change her schedule going forward? Because despite the fact that she tested negative today, that doesn't mean she'll continue to test negative tomorrow and the days beyond that.
That's right. She was outside of Washington herself yesterday. She's now embarking on a multi-state, multi-city tour highlighting summer learning programs. Of course, the First Lady, an educator herself. So this is part of her official schedule. So the only time I can think of, aware of, that they were last together was with that meeting with the First Lady of Ukraine 2 days ago. But it's also worth noting that the Vice President, Kamala Harris, she had just taken off from Washington about 10 a.m. this morning. She has an event this afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, Carolina. The Office of the Vice President telling me at this point there hadn't been any decisions made about whether she should cancel that event, whether she should continue with her travel. But I think what we're going to continue to see from the White House and hear from White House officials over the course of the day ahead is that, of course, they're taking the president's health seriously, but that the concern at this level, at this moment, is not significant. They want to try to portray calm, steadiness.
Got it.
That has really been sort of the watchword of Biden's team throughout this entire COVID epidemic, that they want to model good behavior, that they want to take good precautions, but that given where we are as a country, in part, as they would likely say, because of the work the president has done with the American Rescue Plan, other initiatives to try to make COVID treatments available, vaccines available, the concern about his health is nowhere where it would have been, we should say, there it was 2 years ago when President Trump, of course, contracted COVID in the late stages of that 2020 campaign, without vaccines available, without the kind of treatments necessarily that are available as well now.
Yeah, quite a different time, to say the least. Memoli, if you would stand by for me, I would appreciate it. Want to bring in Dr. Uche Blackstock now into the conversation. Dr. Blackstock, thanks for jumping on for us. We appreciate it.
Sure.
Quite a day, to say the least. Now, the president, in fact, testing positive for COVID at 79 years of age. We hear he's doing quite well, as the First Lady said, and as we're hearing from the press office as well. He is now also being administered Paxilvid. Talk to me about some of your concerns here, especially considering his advanced age.
All right. So, Yasmin, thank you so much for having me. I think this news was inevitable. We see with all of the COVID protections being lifted, it was only a matter of time before the president had contracted COVID. And so, yes, he is high risk simply because of his age. I think other than that, he's in pretty good shape. He has, the best healthcare out there. So I know that, starting the Paxilvid very quickly is important. We know that has a significant impact on decreasing hospitalizations and people with COVID. But again, he is in that high risk group. And we know that even people who have been vaccinated and double boosted are still at risk for serious disease that could lead to hospitalization. So his team is going to need to keep a very close eye on him. And I think what they can do for the American public is really keep us posted on his status and how he's doing, because even though he may be feeling well now, things can change very quickly. So that messaging is going to be critically important for us.
Yeah, and we're also learning now that White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, along with the coronavirus response coordinator Ashish Shah, will be holding a press conference later on today to give us an update on the president's status. So we're going to be bringing that to you whenever it is that happens. Let's talk also about the decision to take Paxilvid, right? Because not everybody who tests positive for COVID, in fact, takes that treatment. Why do you think in this instance, his doctors, the folks that are making this decision for him, guiding him, chose to give him this treatment?
Right. And so when you actually look at the package insert, the criteria, that encompasses high risk is quite wide. So age is one of them, but also other chronic diseases or being immunosuppressed. And so that is the first step to making sure that President Biden does well, taking this medication that I think of all the therapeutics out there, besides the vaccines, it has been shown to be incredibly effective. And so that's a 5-day course. What we have seen is that sometimes people experience some rebound symptoms after they finish that course. So he's going to have to be watched very closely to make sure that doesn't happen.
I want to bring in Dr. Vin Gupta as well. Dr. Blackstock, if you would stand by for us, we would appreciate it. Dr. Gupta, give me your reaction first in hearing the president has now, in fact, tested positive for COVID.
Well, Yasmin, good morning. It's not unsurprising, despite all the precautions that they're taking, that this is happening. It's happening all across the country. Really relieved to hear that it's just mild symptoms right now. I think, as Dr. Blackstock said, lots of considerations here. One was the time from his last booster dose. That's going to help us guide and really understand what his risk is for any type of progression. If it's outside, say, 4 months, that's when we know, especially at his age at 79, that perhaps the vaccine may not be as effective in this era of Omicron at preventing, say, severe pneumonia. So that time to last booster is going to be important to tease out. Paxilvid indication, absolutely the right move by his physicians at the White House, because we know that early intervention right after diagnosis, within that 24 to 48 hour window, Yasmin, helps really reduce the risk of ending up in the hospital if he does have vaccine, if he does have any risk of progression. So he's going to further reduce that with starting Paxilvid early. And then I'm certain that his physicians are going to be looking at overall, how is the president functioning? Is he lethargic from his baseline? Is he fatigued, more fatigued than, say, after a normal day as president? That might prompt them to do. I'm sure they're going to be doing frequent vital sign checking, oxygen monitoring. And yet it remains unclear, are they going to do anything in addition to that, say take him to a hospital, Walter Reed, to get a chest x-ray, for example. It doesn't seem like that's necessary at this moment from what we know, but it certainly seems like we'll be staying tuned to see how things develop in the next 6 hours.
Dr. Gupta, on our air a few days ago, you were raising the red flag when it came to this new Omicron variant, BA.5, which at certain instances, it seems, was evading the vaccine altogether, kind of raising the warning sign that we have yet another surge ahead of us, possibly, and to be as vaccinated as possible. And herein lies the example of how COVID does, in fact, not discriminate whether you are a bus driver or the president of the United States.
Yasmin, that's right. And so for all your viewers out there, expect, one, that the daily caseloads that we keep hearing about are a gross underestimate of what actually is happening in the world around us, that we're estimating maybe we're capturing actually 10%, Yasmin, of the cases that are actually happening in the communities around us. One, that means, let me emphasize this, that the vaccines are doing their job. They're keeping folks away from pulmonologists like myself. So that's important. If we didn't have vaccines, we would be seeing surging hospitals, worse than what we saw in the worst days of winter 2020 and 2021. So the vaccines are working. Paxilvid, really critically. I know we're talking about boosters. When are we going to get an updated booster? Because the vaccines are sensitive to the fact that this virus is changing. But it's important to emphasize that Paxilvid, thankfully, even if the vaccines require booster shots, Paxilvid is what we say variant agnostic. It doesn't matter what the variant is. It's still going to interrupt its ability to cause infection, progression of disease. And here's why. Paxilvid interrupts the ability of the virus to replicate within the human cell, Yasmin. It disrupts that machinery. So it's important that we have this therapeutic, widely accessible. Biden administration did some great initiatives here about a few weeks ago with pharmacists being able to prescribe this medication with some greater discretion. We need greater access, more provider awareness, more patient awareness, so they're seeking it out. But Paxilvid is resistant to these vaccines and the impact that they're having on the vaccine. Paxilvid is resistant to the variants that are arising, even if the vaccines need updating.
Dr. Gupta, if you could stand by for a moment. Speaker Pelosi is having her daily press conference, and I believe she's addressing the situation with the president. Let's listen in.
So we had the great honor of having the First Lady of Ukraine address members of Congress. I was so pleased that we had such a bipartisan turnout, House and Senate, Leader McConnell, House and Senate, Democratic leadership, to welcome her. It's the tragedy of what is happening to children and women and the rest in the course of this war, how the Russians have used rape as a weapon of war when it is indeed a war crime. I've said to you before that I've been told by those familiar with the Russian tactics that these are not just the soldiers raping girls. This is an order. This is an attempt to demoralize the Ukrainian people and have their appetite.
All right, just taking a listen to Speaker Pelosi there in her daily press briefing. At one point, it seems like we missed it as we were speaking with Dr. Gupta about the president's current situation, addressing the president, in fact, testing positive for COVID. As we've been following this breaking news. By the way, it's 8 minutes to the top of the hour. If you are just joining us, welcome. Good to see you. We are following some breaking news out of the White House right now. The president, in fact, testing positive today for COVID. He has been boosted twice. I'm learning now from MSNBC commentator Jeff Bennett telling me that the president was boosted for a second time on March 30th. As we were just speaking with Dr. Vin Gupta, he said that date was incredibly important as to how much protection he still had. If we have Dr. Gupta still on the line, I'd like to bring him back. Dr. Gupta, as we're learning now of this date, right, you spoke about this second time that he was boosted. I'm now learning it was, in fact, March 30th in which he got this second boost. What does that say to you?
Well, yes, I mean, that means he's in that really very protective 4-month window. We know that after folks get that, whatever shot it might be, number 1 or number 4, that first 4 months is when their protection is at an all-time high. One, from averting infection and also from keeping you out of the hospital. Obviously, the president tested positive, but he still has very strong peak protection against progression, ending up in the hospital with still severe pneumonia. Paxilvid on top of that, it should all reassure us that hopefully the president remains with mild symptoms at worst.
Dr. Gupta, stand by for me if you could. Want to bring in Jen Psaki now, former White House press secretary, joining us now for a reaction to the president's positive COVID test. Jen, thanks for joining us and jumping on to talk about this.
Good morning, Yasmin.
Good morning. Give me your reaction first in hearing the president has in fact tested positive. I'm sure you're not surprised at this point.
No, I mean, I think, Yasmin, as many people would expect who've been following this closely, I think we've been preparing, or they've been preparing for this probably for several months now, given the percentage of people in the country who have tested positive. They were probably bracing for impact, I bet, before they made this statement this morning, because they knew there would be a lot of reactions, obviously from media, but certainly maybe from the markets, from other leaders. But what they've done so far over the last less than an hour since the news came out is done 2 smart things. One is they've been very transparent. They made clear that he was taking Paxilvid. His symptoms have been mild. And the second thing they did was to make clear that they would be giving daily updates. Now, what they need to do over the next couple of days is show him working and show him still active and serving as president. And I'm certain they'll likely do that.
Jen, who's making the decisions when it comes to the schedule of the vice president now, who we heard was in the error when we learned of the positive COVID test of the president, along with the first lady who's currently in Detroit, who's currently still testing negative?
So the vice president's office in the West Wing is right around the corner from the chief of staff's office. There's a very close working relationship, especially in moments like this, in nearly every White House. I think it's important, though, for viewers to know and understand the president is still serving in his job. And in many ways, the White House is set up for that, because he lives and he works there, right? He lives above the shop. And so anything he needs to do, whether it is conducting a call with a foreign leader, having a meeting with aides, it is all set up for him to continue to do his job. And obviously, as long as his symptoms continue to be mild.
Was the president aware and planning for this eventual positive test during your time in the White House? And was it something that he was concerned about, considering, Jen, of course, his advanced age?
Well, I think, as you noted, Yasmin, the president and anyone around him took every step possible. He received that second booster just back at the end of March, not only to protect his own health, but to send a message to the country about how important that is. I think anyone is preparing for the possibility they may test positive. I mean, I've had COVID twice, right? And I was pretty careful and took every precaution necessary. It can happen. But what is hugely important here is the reason he is having mild symptoms is because he was boosted twice and because he took those precautions. But yes, you're preparing. He has obviously a doctor who's his personal doctor. Every president has access to the best medical care in the world. And fortunately, every White House, regardless of whether you're going through a pandemic or not, is prepared for the president to serve in a variety of places, locations, including recovering from COVID in the White House.
This is certainly a president who has allowed his personal experiences in his life to drive certain policy decisions that he has made during his time as not only president, but vice president as well. Do you expect the same thing to happen here now that he has been diagnosed with COVID?
I absolutely. And if I'm understanding your question, Yasmin, the right way, look, I think he makes risk assessments. The White House makes risk assessments, just like the American people do. That's not always easy, right? Every day you're making risk assessments about whether you're exposing yourself or not. He got that extra booster. That's something, obviously, the CDC and health experts recommend every American do. But in addition to that, he knows he wants to still engage and interact with people across the country. That means, and you were asking me about whether he's been prepared. Sure, every time he held the baby or held that child from Ukraine in that photo from Poland from months ago, you know that there's a risk. there's a risk, and we all operate with those risks every day. But I have no doubt he will continue to operate once he recovers from COVID as somebody, as a leader who wants to engage with people across the country. And that's an assessment that he makes and really everybody makes every day.
Well, and I'm wondering, Jen, kind of what goes into that risk assessment, right? When you had a president now that has tested positive for COVID, he's been twice boosted. We're learning the last booster that he, in fact, received was March 30th. As we look ahead towards the midterm elections in November, this is certainly going to be a president on the road, right, trying to push his policy agenda and get as many votes for Democrats as he can between now and November. How to make that risk assessment and who exactly is doing it?
Well, he does it through consultation with his doctor, just like any American can, right? And through the team at the White House. But it's important to him and important to them that he's out there in the country. And I have no doubt he will continue to be. But he's also going to follow and abide by any health guidance that is out there. That's done by what's recommended publicly by the CDC to every American, of course. And he does that in consultation with his doctor as well. But that also means, you know, I am sitting right now, I will tell you, in a parking lot in a Barnes, outside of a Barnes & Noble, because I wanted to pick up a book for a friend. I wore a mask in the Barnes & Noble, but I went into the Barnes & Noble, right? We all make assessments every day. My kids are at summer camp this summer, just like other kids. But my son just got his second booster, thanks to the amazing science, right? So my point is that he will make those assessments in consultation with his doctor and the team at the White House, just like everyone does. But part of his job, just like mine is to be a mom and to go to work and things like that, but part of his job is to engage with the American people. And I have no doubt that that is going to weigh heavily and be important to him going into the fall as the Democrats are fighting to maintain control.
By the way, my 3-year-old just got his second shot as well. It was quite a moment when he got that free car and free lollipop with that free shot.
We did the same thing. We also got a free car for my 4-year-old, but it's all worth it. Second shot. It's exciting days for those of us with kids under 5.
Feels like freedom around the corner. Jen, thanks for jumping on for us. As always,
my pleasure.
We appreciate it. Good to talk to you. So if you're just joining us, everybody, it is the top of the hour. Welcome. I'm Yasmin Vossoughian. You're watching MSNBC. We're following some breaking news out of Washington, D.C. We are now getting in, as we've been following the story for the last 45 minutes or so. The president, in fact, is now tested positive for COVID-19. He has been boosted twice. The last booster he received was, in fact, on March 30th. We are being told he is experiencing mild symptoms. He's doing quite well, as we heard from the First Lady, who spoke to her husband a little bit earlier on today. He's currently getting treatment with Paxilvid, as we hear that, and that is to reduce the likelihood that, in fact, he would be hospitalized or have more severe symptoms from COVID. The First Lady has tested negative as well. The Vice President has been informed of the President's positive test as well. So we're following this breaking news story out of Washington. And, of course, the fallout from all of this, because the President has an incredibly busy schedule ahead and how he's going to deal with all of that. With that, I want to bring in Mike Memley once again, who's been standing by for us and following exactly what's happening inside the White House right now as the President continues to isolate. We're being told as well, Mike, the President will, in fact, isolate until, they're being quite conservative about this, it seems, until he tests negative. If you know differently than me, let me know. What else are you hearing?
No, that is, in fact, Yasmin, the White House protocols for just this scenario, whether you're the President of the United States or whether you're a junior White House staffer. But we just got some brand new information in the form of a memo from Dr. Kevin O'Connor. I mentioned him earlier. He is the President's chief physician. And this is the first full summary of the President's health. And I'll read you from that letter. Dr. O'Connor writing that this morning, as part of our routine screening program for the President, he was, through an antigen test, tested positive. This result was subsequently confirmed by PCR testing. Dr. O'Connor continues that he, on questioning President Biden, is currently experiencing mild symptoms, runny nose, fatigue with an occasional dry cough, which started yesterday evening. He meets FDA criteria for Paxilvid, so Dr. O'Connor writes, I recommended initiating such treatment. Dr. O'Connor also notes that the President is fully vaccinated and twice boosted, so I anticipate that he will respond favorably. Early use of Paxilvid in this case provides additional protection against severe disease. And as you just mentioned, Dr. O'Connor also saying he will isolate in accordance with CDC recommendations and that he would keep the White House updated as it continues. We expect Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, to hold a briefing this afternoon at the White House in which we can expect further updates. It is worth noting, I should note, that Karine Jean-Pierre was among those traveling with President Biden yesterday. She was both on Air Force One, of course, with the president, but also in even closer quarters aboard Marine One with the president. She was wearing a mask when I saw her getting off Marine One last night. But, you know, there has been something of a running joke around the press corps, around the White House even, that as so many individuals in the administration, among staff, have been testing positive for COVID-19, the White House has almost routinely said that the president was not a close contact. So now this question of who is a close contact of the president, given this diagnosis, is one that we're going to be also asking officials about more and more, because those officials, as you would expect now, would be subject to the protocols when somebody does test positive, who they are considered to be a close contact for. The First Lady, her office already indicating that she is now, as a close contact, following CDC guidance in that regard. She'll be masking as well. And so this is going to be something worth tracking going forward. Yasmin, just to step back and put this obviously in the context of where this president is at this moment. Obviously, we've been talking so much about lately the speculation about his political future and the concerns about his age. He turns 80 this year. The White House has been saying for weeks now that this is something that they acknowledge is going to be something talked about in the context of his political future, that there is nothing, as one White House official put it to me, short of a time machine that we can do to deal with the president's age. But this is something, as that official said, you can only show, not tell. And the goal was, now that the president has finished what has been really a gauntlet of foreign travel, of international summits, he's also hosted several here in the United States, that now is the time for the president to get out on the road, to really begin his midterm election travel. Yesterday, we saw him in Massachusetts. Today, he was scheduled to go to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and hold a DNC fundraiser in Philadelphia tonight. The White House has already announced that he was scheduled to go to Florida next week with 2 stops in that key battleground state. So this diagnosis, in that respect, couldn't have come at a worse time, just as the White House was hoping to show the president back out on the road, keeping a full schedule and getting out there in fighting shape for the midterm elections.
Yeah, but absolutely want to reiterate again, if you see on the bottom of your screen the president has in fact tested positive, he is doing fine. It seems he's having mild symptoms. He's tired. He's got a runny nose. He's on Paxilvid. He's been twice boosted at this point. So I want to continue to reiterate that as people are turning on their televisions, hearing this news, and seeing the line at the bottom of their televisions that he is, in fact, we're learning, doing just fine amidst all of this. Want to bring in Mike, if you would. Continue to stand by. Thank you. Simone Sanders, who's standing by for us on the phone for us. Simone, talk to me. Give me your reaction to this positive test for the president and his condition right now.
Hi, Yasmin. I have been listening, and I wish the president well. I'm sure that the president is joining all of his meetings via Zoom today with energy and zealousness. And look, I think given everything that we have heard from Dr. O'Connor, the president's doctor, from the doctors that have been on the show earlier, on the program earlier this morning, given that the president has been boosted, twice boosted, that he is vaccinated, that he regularly, masks in various places and spaces, that he's taking Paxilvid, he's expected to be just fine. But I will say this, Yasmin, I think it's important for folks to know that this is a White House that takes COVID very seriously, but also understands that COVID has not gone away. And so you have to live and work and coexist in the world as it is. And that is a world where the pandemic is, in fact, still raging. So coming off of the international trip, everyone who was on that international trip, including the principal, in this case, the President of the United States of America, they test. And they go into a regular, in addition to their regular testing cadence. And the reason we know that the President of the United States has tested positive is because the White House has protocols in place and they are being transparent. And so I think all Americans should look at what we've seen from the White House this morning as a blueprint, frankly.
Simone Sanders, as always, we thank you. And I'll just take this opportunity, Simone, to say congratulations on your nuptials. You looked amazing. But thanks for jumping on for us amidst all of the craziness over the last couple of weeks. We appreciate it, my friend. Good to talk to you. Want to go back to Dr. Vin Gupta, who's been standing by for us as we have been speaking about the president's positive COVID test here. And we just got this statement in from Dr. Ashish Jha, Dr. Gupta, and I want to just kind of read it to you as to what the president is specifically experiencing now and when he was administered this Paxilvid, saying the Paxilvid started just now. So just a couple of hours ago, it seems. The symptoms are tired, runny nose, dry cough as well. The president went to bed and felt fine, but did not sleep well. And then, in fact, he tested positive this morning. What are you expecting to see as he progresses with his symptoms over the next couple of days when, in fact, he'll be feeling better, despite the fact that these are just mild symptoms, especially now with the treatment of Paxilvid?
Well, Yasmin, this is expected. So for all your viewers out there, what Dr. Jha just articulated are the president's symptoms. They're upper respiratory symptoms. They're cough, runny nose, sore throat, constitutional symptoms, fatigue, malaise, not unexpected. And this is how we expect Omicron, the subvariant BA.5, to actually cause vaccine breakthrough positive tests. Because our immune system, just to nerd out here a little bit, Yasmin, on our immune system in the respiratory tract, we don't have as many antibodies and other immune fighting cells in our nose and in our throat as we do in our lungs. So that's why it's easier for an infection to happen, maybe a sore throat to occur, runny nose to occur, but for pneumonia, the worst of it, to be avoided. So that's what we're seeing. It's not unsurprising. With the initiation of Paxilvid, I expect that the president is going to hopefully remain with these mild symptoms. And I should also clarify here, just in reviewing the president's medical history as published last November by the White House physician, his medical history for 79 years of age is pretty darn robust. He has atrial fibrillation. He's on a blood thinner called Paxilvid. He has reflux, acid reflux. He's on a medication for that. He also has high cholesterol. All things being said here, those medications for which he's treating those conditions are not contraindications for Paxilvid. For everybody out there, just a quick PSA: if you might think that you need Paxilvid because you tested positive for COVID, one of the big things you have to really consider, your physician needs to consider or your pharmacist, does Paxilvid interact with any of the drugs that you're currently taking? In the president's case, they do not, which is a good thing. That's why he's on it. Having said all that, the president at 79 with those conditions, robust health, Yasmin, I think that's the key piece here. Some people consider him to be a super ager. So I suspect with the initiation of Paxilvid, with that past medical history, the fact that he only has mild symptoms, that the likelihood he will progress is very low.
Forgive me, Dr. Gupta, but if you could explain what a super ager is, I would appreciate it.
It's something like President Biden, who's able to bike and be active at 79, and whereas that's typically not necessarily a set of activities that we would expect at 79.
So even with this diagnosis of COVID, experiencing these mild symptoms, taking Paxilvid, having atrial fibrillation, as you say, are you worried at all about long COVID symptoms for this president? Is that something his team is likely considering right now?
You know, what's important to consider, it's something that we should all be mindful of, especially now where I think there's this sense here that there's this inevitability of fatalism. I hear from people that, we're going to test positive at some point if we haven't already. That long COVID is a big concern. It's something that we're learning about as we speak. It causes chronic debilitating symptoms like fatigue and brain fog for many months. Yasmin, we don't have a clear cure yet. Having said all that, the president is twice boosted on top of being fully vaccinated. He's now getting Paxilvid. Risk of developing long COVID, we know in folks that have that as their baseline protection, is quite low. So we know vaccines are protective against developing long COVID. We know Paxilvid, for early anecdotal, this is anecdotal data, I've seen it, I know others have as well, maybe the antiviral Paxilvid actually helps folks that have long COVID. It's being studied as we speak. So there's a lot of balls in the air, but it's to say that the risk that the president develops severe pneumonia or long COVID are lower, far lower, because of the protection.
Certainly good news for the president, for the country as well. Dr. Gupta, if you would, continue to stand by for me. I want to bring in Peter Baker, who's standing by for us as well. Peter, if you would, just kind of talk to me about what else you know, what else you can add as we're learning now of the president testing positive for COVID this morning.
Yeah, Yasmin, I was on that trip with the president last week to the Middle East, and I thought we saw there basically how COVID is sort of haunting this president in a way, because they take COVID very seriously, as Jen Psaki told you earlier. They have a lot of protocols. They have a lot of testing. The staff will walk around the White House with colored bands on the days that they have their tests. If they're going to be in a meeting with the president, they have to be tested. So they do take it very seriously. A lot of the meetings are still done by Zoom, even now. And yet, you see on this trip that we saw in Israel and Saudi Arabia, a president who, is intermingling with people in a very, robust way, right? We saw that again on his domestic trip just yesterday in Massachusetts. When he gets off the plane of Air Force One in Jerusalem, they had told us, well, maybe he won't shake hands because of the new contagious subvariant of COVID. But in fact, he does the fist bump at first, and then he's holding people up close, his face close to theirs. He's putting his arm around them, and within 10 or 15 minutes, he's shaking hands. He can't stop himself from, doing something more distant. Distant does not work for Joe Biden. He wasn't wearing a mask, and he's meeting all these people, whether it be in Israel, whether it be Saudi Arabia, whether it be in Massachusetts, all the time. And of course, it seems like this is going to catch up to him at some point. Now, fortunately, as everybody has just said, he is vaccinated, double boosted, all these kind of things, relatively healthy for a 79-year-old. But he is a 79-year-old, and you have to worry about that because we've seen certainly that age does make a difference in the impact of this. The important thing, as Jen Psaki said, I think is going to be transparency on the part of the White House. They'll have a briefing later today. We'll have a chance to see what they say in terms of some questions that reporters will ask them.
Well, and I got to say, speaking to what you were just talking about and how it is this president, in fact, interacts, it certainly seems as if, while this seemed inevitable, not necessarily surprising, the president has finally tested positive for COVID, as so many Americans at this point have had, often multiple times, they are certainly prepared as well for this type of diagnosis moving forward, even in the midst of an election year.
Well, they are, and then we are, too, as a public. I think we're no longer as shocked as we once were. Obviously, when President Trump got COVID way back in 2020, it was much more of a sort of a national emergency kind of feel because we didn't have vaccines. We didn't know what would happen. He actually did have some pretty bad symptoms and had to be hospitalized. Now, so many people, so many Americans have had COVID, as you say, once, sometimes twice, even 3 times. It feels familiar to a lot of Americans, so they're going to look at this and say, okay, he's got it. We hope he feels better, but they'll probably move on with their day as long as the news doesn't get worse.
What's the view like from there, Peter Baker, where you are, and the reaction that you're hearing to the president's positive COVID test?
Well, I think the reaction basically is it did feel like it was inevitable, right? That
Right.
There's so few people in America these days who haven't had it at some point or another, that it was going to catch up with him eventually. Again, as somebody who's going to be out there and mingling and interacting with people, he's not going to sit there and stay isolated back in the White House throughout his presidency. And I think, Mike's point is a good one, which is that this is disappointing to him because he did want to get out on the road. He did
Right.
want to start this midterm campaign. In some ways, it's maybe not bad that it happened in July, because hopefully for him, that means he'll get over it soon and be able to get out on the road and be pretty robust through the fall. But obviously, nobody wishes any ill health on the president.
Hopefully just a summer sojourn, a summer holiday for this president at the White House till he can resume his activities elsewhere. Peter Baker, thank you for jumping on. We appreciate it. We're going to continue to follow this breaking news. Everybody, if you are just joining us, the president has in fact tested positive for COVID early this morning. He is doing okay, doing just fine, experiencing some mild symptoms, just a runny nose, tired as well. He's currently taking Paxilvid for treatment. We also heard from the First Lady, who says she has spoken with her husband. He is feeling just fine, okay. And so we're following this breaking news for you, bringing you the news as we get it, more developments as we get it. We'll take a break, and we'll be right back. Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Yasmin Vossoughian. If you're just joining us, we are following some big breaking news out of Washington. The president has, in fact, tested positive for COVID. He's 79 years of age, the White House saying. He's experiencing very mild symptoms. White House COVID response coordinator, Dr. Ashish Jha, telling NBC News the president is tired. He has a runny nose. He has a dry cough as well. The White House is saying he is fully vaccinated and twice boosted. And they say he has begun taking the antiviral drug Paxilvid. The First Lady, who is currently in Detroit, Michigan, considered a close contact, has in fact tested negative and addressed how he's doing this morning.
My husband tested positive for COVID. I talked to him just a few minutes ago. He's doing fine. He's feeling good. I tested negative this morning. I am going to keep my schedule. I am, according to CDC guidelines, I am keeping masks. And so I'd like to go in and see the program here. Learning loss as an educator means a lot to me. So thank you for being here today. Thank you.
All right, with me now, NBC's Mike Memoli at the White House for us. Yamiche Alcindor's on set with me. Dr. Vin Gupta, a MSNBC medical contributor, joining us as well. Memoli, let me just go to you first, if you would, and just kind of reset what you know so far about how the president's doing and what's being done to monitor his condition during this time.
Well, Yasmin, we just heard in the last half hour or so from Dr. Kevin O'Connor, who is the president's chief physician, has been his chief physician since his time as vice president, so a long relationship. He indicated that, yes, the president is experiencing mild symptoms, a runny nose, a little bit of fatigue. These symptoms they began late last night. We understand the president actually had a bit trouble sleeping, in fact, and that he was tested this morning, first an antigen test, and then when that showed a positive result, they confirmed it with a PCR test. He is now isolating at the White House. He will be monitored. He has been given Paxilvid, of course, that treatment, which Dr. O'Connor indicates has been one that shows positive results in most of those who receive it, and that they would continue monitoring his symptoms over time. It's worth reminding, Yasmin, what the COVID protocols are within the White House at this point, because I just, in fact, last week had a number of conversations with the White House, because this was the matter of not just official intrigue given the rise of the BA.5 variant. I was asking the White House if they were reevaluating the protocols at this point, potentially strengthening them given the concern about it. But it was also a matter of diplomatic intrigue, because you'll remember just before the president left for that Middle East trip, the White House actually said he would try to actually limit his physical interaction with the officials he was meeting because of concern about the transmissibility in part of the BA.5 variant. Now, that explanation struck some as odd, because we know what was on the itinerary for the president, a meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. And there was some suggestion that these new protocols for the president, limiting handshakes, other physical contact with officials, was sort of a convenient excuse. Now, we know, of course, the president did not shake hands with the Crown Prince, but ultimately fist bumped with the Crown Prince. He did shake hands with a number of the other officials there. But the White House last week, in fact, ran me through what the current protocols are, and I want to share them with you because I think they're relevant at this state. First, that any individual at the White House who is scheduled to have a meeting with the president that day is, first of all, almost always wears masks, as this official put it. They try to have these meetings in socially distant settings when possible, and those officials are also tested the morning of those meetings out of an abundance of caution. Now, they noted, of course, that the president's testing regimen had largely remained consistent through his time in office, often twice a week, often Monday and Thursday, but that those days would vary depending on the president's travel. So it's notable, of course, today is Thursday, a day when he typically would have been given a test just as a matter of that regular testing regimen. And then this was something of a back and forth with the White House last month as well, because it seemed that the White House was actually stepping back from regular disclosure publicly of those positive tests. During the campaign, when I was covering every day of the Biden campaign, once we entered the COVID era, each and every time the president then candidate was tested, they released those results proactively. More recently, though, the White House was not necessarily answering reporters' questions about when his most recent tests were. Last week, it's worth noting, they did release those proactively because it was relevant to his travel. Our colleague Kelly O'Donnell actually pressed Karine Jean-Pierre just on Monday about whether she would release any follow-up testing after his trip. And in fact, they did release initially a negative test on Tuesday. So this issue of how the White House protocols are, typically they took great pride in these protocols because up till this point, the president had not been diagnosed with COVID-19. He was able to get through that whole fall campaign and through the first year and a half. Yesterday it actually was a full year and a half in office for President Biden without receiving COVID. But at the same time, White House officials had always indicated that it was possible he would get it. They weren't shying away from that fact, and that in this moment, and we've seen that moment now come, he would be given the best care, and that their level of concern about what would happen was minimal at this point. But naturally, of course, we're going to hear from the White House and from Dr. Jha later today, in which we'll get more information about what happens now moving forward.
And we just got some news on that, Mike, as you were talking. We're going to be getting these daily briefings, of course, on the president's condition as he continues to test positive, and we're learning now at 2 p.m. Eastern time both White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre and Dr. Ashish Jha will be addressing the nation per the president's condition as he continues to grapple with his COVID diagnosis. Want to bring in Dr. Vin Gupta once again because he does have to run. He does have a day job. So, Dr. Gupta, thanks for sticking with us throughout as we look ahead towards this press briefing at 2 p.m. and, of course, continue to learn about the president's condition, hoping those symptoms remain mild. What are you going to be looking for and listening for?
Well, Yasmin, just to follow up, and just a real quick point of minor modification here. Paxilvid, that anticoagulant that President Biden takes for atrial fibrillation, his dose probably was adjusted by Dr. O'Connor and his White House team. That is just the one point here. A lot of Americans take that medication. Want to emphasize that. It's also important to note in that Dr. O'Connor's evaluation back in November of 2021, normal chest X-ray, Yasmin, normal heart function as well. So those are really critical points here. Normal heart, normal lungs, that is an excellent baseline to start with if you're having to deal with a positive COVID infection. Lastly, I'll just say, as we're going to be hearing more in the coming hours about his condition, again, a look at his vital sign trend. What is his oxygen doing? How is his lethargy? Is he improving in the next 24 to 48 hours, which we would expect with initiation of Paxilvid? And then this is sort of an off-label question here, but something that is very top of mind for clinicians like myself when we're treating patients with Paxilvid. Do you stop at day 5? I recognize the FDA emergency use authorization has 5 days of Paxilvid, but in somebody that's higher risk like President Biden, do you potentially go for a longer period of time? That is something that's happening off-label and anecdotally, I can share that. Is that something in an abundance of caution? Do you do that to prevent the risk of rebound, which we know is happening more and more? Again, an off-label use, something we're studying, but an important consideration.
Really good stuff, as always. Things that we need to consider as we listen and watch the president's progression through all of this. Dr. Gupta, I'll let you go. Thank you for your time today, sir. Appreciate it. Yamiche, let's talk timeline here, right? Because we talked about, as Dr. Gupta expertly put it in the last hour, which is that last booster shot we know now was March 30th. Walk us through exactly kind of the president's timeline here, when it is he got vaccinated to when he got boosted, some of the concerns in that decision-making as well.
Well, President Biden really did approach this in the way that he wanted all Americans to approach it. He wanted to make sure that he got his vaccines, got all the boosters. So I want to walk you through exactly when he did that. He got his first dose of the Pfizer vaccine in December 2020, the second in January 2021, and then he got his first Pfizer booster shot on September 2021. And then, as you said, he got a second booster on March 30th, 2022. And he said at the time when he got that second booster shot, and I think this is really important to point out, he said because of testing, treatments, and more, we're in a new moment in this pandemic. It does not mean COVID-19 is over. It means COVID-19 no longer controls our lives. And as you hear the White House now saying that he's going to be working full time, he's going to be continuing to do all of his duties, continuing to be the president of the United States doing this. This is him saying, I can do this. I can be healthy even at 79 when I obviously in the high risk category in terms of just for age. I feel fine. I can continue to do my job. So the president was really trying to telegraph that politics should be set aside. And we know that this got so politicized with vaccines and the sort of debates that we're having around this country. But I think it's remarkable that he has every step of the way done this on live TV in a lot of cases. I remember being in the room when he was getting his first booster. He was literally taking questions from reporters as he got that shot. And it's because he really wanted to tell people this can be transparent. We should all be in this together. I also want to point out that as he's going to be doing his job full time with COVID, so is Benny Thompson, right? Tonight we're doing the January 6th committee hearing, this 8 big summer hearing on prime time. He's going to be doing this hearing, chairing it remotely because he has COVID. So it also tells you that in 2022, while the pandemic is still going through and, of course, impacting so many people, there are, at the highest levels of our governments, people telegraphing that you can continue to do your job if you feel well enough to do it.
Memily, I'm going to take a quick break. Before we do, though, do you expect to hear from this president soon, considering, of course, as we heard from the former press secretary, we do not have Mike Memly. So hold that question, because I'd like to know the answer to that, if in fact we're likely going to be hearing from the president or not. Yamiche, you got something?
I don't have anything on whether or not we'll hear from the president himself. I have been talking to White House officials who, of course, are saying that Karine Jean-Pierre and medical professionals will be coming out to talk. But the fact that, of course, the president is saying he's going to continue doing his job, I wouldn't be surprised if we got something from the president. But, of course, it would have to be remotely because he is working in quarantine. So it's going to be sort of a challenge to figure out how you actually get someone in the room with him him to do that.
Yeah. Does the president know how to set up a Zoom?
Right. We might have a president that Skypes in, of course.
Skypes in to the world, to broadcast to the world. He's doing A-OK. Thanks, Yamiche. You're sticking with me.
Yeah.
Don't go anywhere. All right, we're following this breaking news, everybody. Once again, if you're just joining us bottom of the hour, we're going to take a quick break. The president, in fact, testing positive for COVID, but he's experiencing mild symptoms, dry cough, runny nose. He's tired, but he's doing A-OK at this point. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. It's 35 past the hour. We are continuing to follow this breaking news story. The president has, in fact, tested positive for COVID-19 this morning. He is experiencing mild symptoms, currently taking Paxilvid for treatment, starting that treatment early this morning. He is experiencing a dry cough, a runny nose. He is lethargic, but he is being monitored. He is continuing to work, and he is doing just fine, as the First Lady put it earlier today, speaking from Detroit, Michigan. We're continuing to follow the president's condition throughout the next couple of days. We're also going to be hearing from the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, as well as Dr. Ashish Shah on the president's condition at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be bringing that to you as soon as that happens. With that, I want to bring in Douglas Brinkley, a presidential historian who's been standing by for us. Douglas, good to have you. Thanks for joining us by phone. We appreciate you jumping on. Give me first kind of your reaction to this president's diagnosis, of course, juxtaposing it to the last time we had a president test positive in the White House.
Well, it's just part of modern life. Whenever you hear the word COVID, and particularly when it's your diagnosis, you kind of freeze for a second. COVID became the word for the pandemic, for the plague. It's what everybody's been trying to avoid. But alas, there's a kind of herd immunity taking place in America now. Everybody's life's been touched by COVID, and it seems that foreign travel is still risky. There'll be an attempt to do detective work to try to figure out exactly where Joe Biden contracted the virus, but alas, that's going to be a fool's errand. But probably when he was in Saudi Arabia or Israel, it occurred. I mean, yesterday he was in Somerset, Massachusetts, and anybody you're seeing on MSNBC's, photo frame with Biden has to now test to make sure that they don't have COVID. But it is kind of heartening in one regard, and that is that when President Trump got COVID, remember the drama of that when he got rushed to Walter Reed Hospital and he was peering out of windows, and then he came to the White House and ripped the mask off. In this case, you have a president who's had all of his vaccinations, had his booster, and this should be nothing more than a case of snivels and isolation due to the great medical technology we now have with controlling the severity of COVID-19.
Douglas, how important do you think it is that we hear from the president himself during this period, considering that he is the leader of the nation, as we're being told he's experiencing mild symptoms so far, having treatment with Paxilvid? How important do you think it is that we hear from him personally during this period?
It's absolutely necessary that he talks to the American people. I wouldn't do it through a reporter. If he's up to it, just a feed that could be, downloaded on people's iPhones saying, like many Americans, I now have COVID, I've put myself in isolation, and I'm going to do the proper protocols. I would say when President Biden leaves the White House someday, he's going to want to say, I tried to educate the American public on how to deal with COVID if they got it. And so he's going to do all the right things and say all the right things. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is going to be his surrogate. She may continue to go to Pennsylvania, where he's due to have a speech. There's a fundraiser he has tonight. A slate of things are going to obviously be canceled for the president, but she can go forward and replace him at some of these events if necessary.
Douglas Brinkley, presidential historian, we appreciate you joining us this hour, sticking through this breaking news. Thank you. Before we go to Dr. Peter Hotez, we're going to talk to him in just one moment. Yamiche, I know you're getting some information in on the vice president. I'm also hearing that she has just landed in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hopefully she'll be speaking to reporters there, and we can bring that to you. But what are you learning on her current condition?
Yeah, so on background, a White House official is saying that the vice president tested negative for COVID-19. She last saw the president on Tuesday. They're saying that she's going to continue on with her schedule, which of course is going to mean a busy travel day for her. It's important to hear this because while the First Lady is also saying that she's negative, the reporting is that she's going to be heading back to Wilmington because she's a close contact of the president. So two people high in the administration testing negative with two different outcomes. The First Lady saying she's going to go back now to Wilmington, where of course they have a personal home, while the Vice President is continuing with her schedule.
And I'm just being told the Vice President, I should say, did in fact not address reporters, instead just giving the camera a thumbs up. So when it is we hear from either the President or the Vice President per his condition, either way, we're going to be getting that update once again, everybody, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and be getting those updates daily on the President's condition throughout this period that he continues to test positive. Dr. Peter Hotez, want to bring you in now to the conversation as well, as we've been speaking to Dr. Gupta over the last 90 minutes or so since we got this diagnosis in of the President. What it is you're going to be watching for, of course, as we hear about the President's condition, his condition progress, and now, of course, his treatment of Paxilvid.
Yeah, I think there's both a good news story and a concerning news story. The good news story is he is being maxed out on interventions. He's been, as everyone's been reporting, he's been vaccinated and doubly boosted. He's on Paxilvid, which works in the early phase of inhibiting virus replication. The concerning news is his age, and we know that as good as 2 boosts are, which is the best we can do, the Centers for Disease Control reported last week that 2 boosts are about 80% protective against hospitalization and 66% protective against emergency room visits. And that's just a week or so after getting the boost, and we know that protection declines subsequently. So I think we have to be very cautious, and that even though he is doubly boosted and not on Paxilvid, he still could progress over the next 24 to 48 hours. So this is someone, obviously, because of age, you want to watch very closely, and I think we should not be profoundly disappointed if we find out that he is brought to Walter Reed for observation and for closer monitoring. I'm hoping that doesn't happen. I think it's more likely he won't require that, but that is a possibility that I think we should be watching for over the next 24, 48 hours.
Talk to me about the timing of the boosters, because Dr. Gupta brought this up as well, right? You talk about when it is he got his second booster and how much protection he has now. So we know it was March 30th. So we're about 4 months away from March 30th. When you're looking at the... Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's when you start to see the decline in the effectiveness of the boosters. And this is why the FDA and CDC have been wringing their hands about whether we should move towards doing a more variant-specific booster, or whether by the time it's ready, this BA.5 variant, subvariant, will be in the rearview mirror, or whether we should switch to a different type of technology to give longer protection. So all those discussions are ongoing. And then the question is, should we start advancing to a third immunization, a third booster for the American people and for someone like President Biden? The problem is we're having a lot of trouble convincing Americans to take even the first booster. Only about 30% of Americans are doing that. I took the second booster, and a lot of my colleagues, but very few Americans are doing that. So I think there's a lot of booster fatigue in the country.
What are you looking at, though, with that in mind, right? If you are of advanced age, you are immunocompromised in certain ways. I mean, are we looking at a booster every single year at this point?
Or possibly more frequently until we come up with another strategy. And so that's what I've been critical of the White House and HHS about, is they've not really come up with an overarching strategy for how we're going to manage the next year or so of the pandemic. Ultimately, we're going to advance towards a universal coronavirus vaccine. We're working on that as well as other groups, but that's not going to be ready for at least a year or two. So how do we manage the next few months while the pandemic is still with us with highly transmissible subvariants? And there's a lot of discussion within the scientific community on how to do that. But instead, what HHS and the White House tend to be doing is they're kind of sitting back and letting suggestions come from the pharma companies. And I've been critical to say, look, what the White House and HHS really need to do is set a strategy and a target product profile for what you want, and tell the pharma companies this is what we want.
Do certain variants come back around, Dr. Hotez? And I wonder this because if we're getting a booster that would protect against, for instance, BA.5 in October, BA.5 has already run through the country, the world, really, at that point. What's the point?
I agree, and that's exactly what I've said. Is by the time that BA.5 subvariant booster is ready, it could be well behind us, and we could be onto something entirely new. And so, therefore, rather than trying to play a guessing game with what variants are coming next, perhaps boost with a technology that could give longer, more durable protection. And I think that may be possible with possibly moving past mRNA technologies, and then advance towards a universal coronavirus vaccine over the next year or two. But for now, I think, it's all hands on deck looking after the president. Everyone is saying, because he's doubly boosted, he's out of the woods. I think you have to be careful about that. It's true that we don't see high mortality, but he still could get sick based on the vaccine effectiveness data that we've seen coming out of the CDC. Hopefully, the Paxilvid treatment will do a lot to mitigate against that.
We all hope that is for sure. Dr. Peter Hotez, we thank you. Appreciate it. Want to bring in now Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthy, a Democrat from Illinois and a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thanks for joining us on this. Give me first kind of your reaction and learning of this news from the White House. The president has, in fact, tested positive for COVID.
Well, I wish him a speedy recovery. I had COVID earlier this year, and I know that it's not fun, but in his case, I'm told that they're mild symptoms. Seems like he's tired, and he's got a runny nose with a dry cough. And so hopefully he can just get a little bit of rest here. I know he's going to continue to be productive, but it's important for him to rest and get back quickly, because we need him now more than ever.
It's interesting because, as you said, now more than ever, right? Democrats are certainly in a precarious time as you march towards the midterm elections. As we know, the president has been on the road quite a lot, and he was going to ramp up his schedule even more in the coming weeks. It's certainly going to put a wrench in that plan. How important is it that the president, the White House, is transparent about his condition during this time period and continues to really kind of show up for the American people? And that just means communicating even about his health during that time period as you look towards November.
I think it's important. I think they're doing a great job so far. They told us that he's going to be isolating in the residence. He's going to be Zooming in terms of having his meetings with people. And then he's going to remain isolated until he tests negative. And I'm sure they're going to take extra precautions, including, I'm glad that he's taking the antiretroviral drug Paxilvid. I took it. Members of my family took it. It's safe, and it's very effective.
Have you had any other symptoms after taking Paxilvid, as some have talked about?
No, none whatsoever. And I want to also say that it helps to combat the possibility of long COVID. My wife is a physician and an anesthesiologist, and she was on the front lines intubating a lot of these patients at the start. One of the things that she's noticed is that folks who take this Paxilvid treatment are able to stay out of the hospitals and also to see their symptoms slightly milder than otherwise.
Congressman Krishnamoorthy, thank you so much. We appreciate you jumping on for us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Want to bring in now NBC News Chief Washington Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, who's been standing by for us. Andrea, good to talk to you, my friend. What are you hearing from there? I know that you spoke with the CIA director just yesterday. Incredible work on that, by the way. What are you hearing there on the ground as we hear of this diagnosis for the president testing positive for COVID?
Well, White House officials, of course, are determined to be transparent. And they have that in contrast to, of course, with former President Trump, who was not transparent when he got COVID. We were not informed about the very, very low, dangerously low oxygen levels when he first walked out across the South Lawn and went to the hospital. Then he did that ride with the Secret Service when he still was fairly sick. Now we're being told they are mild symptoms. He is taking Paxilvid. Look, I had COVID last, I guess in May, and took Paxilvid, never had a temperature, never had any symptoms at all. So I know that Paxilvid does work depending on your own system. I've also was double boosted, as the president was, boosted in March, just as he was. And look, it's worrisome. And it's politically worrisome, importantly, because he was supposed to go to Pennsylvania today. And just the other day, I was talking to a very well-placed Pennsylvania Democratic official, elected official, just about how perilous the situation is for Democrats in Pennsylvania. It's a state I know so well, covered it for decades as a local reporter and then nationally, of course. And they're in trouble this year. Josh Shapiro, the very popular Pennsylvania Attorney General, incumbent Attorney General, is only 4 points ahead right now of the Republican nominee, Mastriano, who is within the margin of error. And Mastriano marched on January 6th, wants a total abortion ban. I mean, is far to the right of any moderate Republican. So it's a very big issue. It's an open seat because the Democratic governor there is term limited. And he was going to Wilkes-Barre, which is very close to Scranton today, the president, his hometown. So there was a lot at stake there. Also, John Fetterman, the Democratic nominee for Senate, has not been seen except for one print interview this week. He's supposed to make his campaign debut tonight, but he had a stroke 3 days before the election day and is far sicker than he was, than he let on initially, and is still recovering from that stroke. So it's really important for this president to show, and this White House to show, that he's able to work. He's 79 years old. He's going to be 80 on November 20th. And I've covered other presidents when they became ill, Yasmin, and especially Ronald Reagan, who was not as old as this president, but was then considered the oldest president. And when he was running against Walter Mondale, age became a big issue in that reelection. And he had to deflect that with one-liners and with very well-staged campaign activities, and did deflect it. But that was before his social media and before presidents were as exposed minute by minute, second by second, to any gaffe, any mistake. So this president has to show that this illness, COVID, which they had long prepared and worried about, can be overcome quickly, and that he is back on the job and is still on the job. As I think you were interviewing Jen Psaki, the former press secretary, of course, earlier. Presidents are on the job unless they are under anesthesia, and then they write a letter and are temporarily turning power over to the vice president and then resuming power afterwards. So I remember when Ronald Reagan was first diagnosed with colon cancer, and we all were brought to the Naval Hospital, and there was a dramatic news conference there, which was after his surgery for colon cancer. It was quite shocking to all of us, and the head of the National Cancer Institute said the president has cancer. And Nancy Reagan at the time was furious about that because her view was they cut it out so he doesn't have cancer. He had cancer. And they were very worried about the appearance and the suggestion that he was ill. Other presidents, George Herbert Walker Bush, if I could say this, he threw up on the Japanese prime minister on a foreign trip. He had the flu. And at a state dinner, no less, on camera.
That's a moment.
George W. Bush choked on a pretzel. And it turned out that he had some kind of issue. It may have been an arrhythmia. After he left office, he had some heart issues. And he was very athletic, a mountain biker. So other presidents have had issues. Of course, back in the day, we never knew that JFK had serious kidney disease and a terrible back issue. And a lot of other things we didn't know about JFK. And we didn't know, most people did not see FDR in a wheelchair, even though he was paralyzed with polio. He always was covered with a blanket, and they made an effort to have him stand up. So it's very important in the modern age for presidents to be as transparent as possible. And that's what this White House is attempting to do.
And in speaking about that transparency, as you said, Andrea, and the importance of this president continue to show up and to work despite his COVID diagnosis, I do want to go to Mike Memoli on that, who has some more developing news on this situation. And Mike, I'm wondering the consideration this White House is now putting into when, in fact, the president will speak to the American people despite this COVID diagnosis just a couple hours ago, really, at this point.
Yeah, you can certainly understand discussions are happening behind closed doors right now among White House officials about the best path forward, including potentially the means by which President Biden might be able to speak to the country, or at least address the country, whether it's in a form of a tape video or not. It's worth noting, of course, not just the First Lady is traveling outside Washington today, we've heard from her, but also Vice President Harris, who was actually aboard Air Force Two when the news of the president's diagnosis first broke. When she just landed in Charlotte a few moments ago, she didn't address reporters, but a spokesperson for the vice president releasing a tweet in which she says that the vice president's schedule today with an event in North Carolina will continue as planned. And in fact, we expect her to, when she speaks at 1:30 p.m. this afternoon, to address the fact of the president's diagnosis today. The vice president has spoken by phone with President Biden today. They were last together, according to the vice president's office, on Tuesday. No word on whether she is considered a close contact at this point. And in terms of transparency, it's also worth noting the White House Twitter account just now has posted the letter from the president's doctor, Dr. Kevin O'Connor, that I was reading from earlier today. So this is an indication of the kind of transparency they're trying to show. But also, I think the attitude the White House is trying to convey at this point, that they are not concerned, that yes, this is a matter of importance, but they are going to be transparent. And I'm reminded of, in fact, of a moment during the 2020 campaign when I was covering then candidate Biden. The day that President Trump was diagnosed with COVID, the then candidate Biden went ahead with his schedule. He tested and tested negative back home in Wilmington, traveled as planned to Michigan to try to carry the keep calm and carry on message that they're now doing in the White House.
Yeah, and it seems as if that exact same message is being sent to the country right now amidst the president's diagnosis of COVID. Mike Memoli, thank you. Yamiche Alcindor, thank you. Ashish Shah, no, we didn't have Ashish Shah on, excuse me. That would have been good, though. Dr. Peter Hotez, thank you. Dr. Vin Gupta, my entire panelists, all my panelists that have been joining me over the last couple of hours, I appreciate you joining me throughout this breaking news. Again, the president testing positive for COVID. However, we're learning he's experiencing mild symptoms at the moment. We're going to continue to follow this breaking news story from here. For now, that wraps it up for me. I'm Yasmin Vossoughian. Chris Jensen picks up coverage with more breaking news after a very short break.